Pandemics and Disease by James Pua. Viruses. How do they work? Spread. How do viruses spread? And why are they so contagious? Once someone is infected with a virus, the virus replicates itself like crazy. Your body basically becomes a storage unit for all these viruses, and once you come in contact with another living organism, it is highly likely for some of the viruses to leave your body and go onto the other living organism's body. The viruses can enter through wounds and through holes in the body like eyes, ears, and your nose. Now, why are they so contagious? Viruses like the coronavirus can be in your body even without you showing physical symptoms that come with it, meaning you could possibly spread the virus to other people without even knowing you have that virus. And if you do have a virus, the virus cells can stay alive on surfaces for up to several days. If someone touches that surface in that time period, they could get the virus. Viruses can also be spread through the air and bodily fluids, which can make it very dangerous. How does a virus work and stay alive? A virus, or virion for the actual virus particle, can get into your body through holes and wounds, and once it finds a cell, it starts the virus replicating process. The virus will bind itself to a cell, known as the host cell in this case, and it will tell the cell to create more virions by injecting its RNA and DNA into the host cell, as seen in this picture. The host cell will basically use all of its proteins and resources in itself to create these virions, which can kill the host cell in the process. Once the virion is made, they can go on to infect other cells in the body. Pretty hardcore. This is also why viruses aren't considered a living organism. They need a host cell to reproduce, meaning they are not living unless they enter another living organism. The plague. What is the plague and what are the symptoms? The plague, also known as the Black Death, is an infectious disease caused by bacteria, known as the Yersinia pestis. This bacteria mainly affected rodents, but fleas went on to feed on these infected animals. The fleas fed on these infected animals and then fed on humans, which transmitted the plague. The plague in England 1348 was the bubonic plague, or the most common one. It was the one out of 3 types that can be caused by Yersinia pestis. The symptoms for the bubonic plague are lymph nodes, also known as buboes, appearing in areas such as the groin, armpit, and neck. These buboes are the size of a chicken egg and should be firm and tender to the touch. These buboes also could expand to the size of an apple. Anyways, sick and weak feeling, fever, chills, and headaches. These symptoms can start 1 to 6 days of contracting the bubonic plague. Symptoms of the plague continued. Bubonic is the only one of 3 types of plagues that occurred in England. It is also the most common plague, but there was also septicemic and pneumonic plague, with pneumonic being the least common. Septicemic plague symptoms include fever, chills, feeling of extreme weakness, feeling of a great pain in the abdomen, vomiting, and diarrhea, bleeding from the mouth, nose, and rectum, and also internal bleeding, which is also bruising. Shock and blackening of tissue, most commonly in fingers, nose, and toes. Pneumonic plague symptoms include coughing out bloody mucus, having a hard time breathing, high fever, weakness, nausea and with vomiting, headaches, and chest pain. This type of plague targets your lungs, which is the least common but can also be the deadliest, since it can be airborne. What happened when the plague came, and how did the plague spread so quickly in England? First of all, let's talk about how it can be transmitted. At first, the plague was transmitted through infected rodents such as rats and fleas that are carrying the bacteria. They can bring bacteria into humans by getting bitten, getting the bacteria into the bloodstream. Scientists also believe that fleas would ride on humans, waiting for another human to feast on. The pneumonic plague is the only plague that causes you to cough, which some scientists believe makes it the only way the plague can be spread through human contact and through the air. Also, it's important to note that that was the only way the plagues could be spread by human contact. So, now the way it was initially spread was during 1347 in Europe, when the 12 Genovese ships that arrived at Misenum. On board these ships were dying or already dead sailors. The people wanted to help these people, but realized that they were riddled with disease, so they were banished. These ships moved on to neighboring islands such as Corsia by November. An interesting story during this time was when a group of Turks, also called Tatars, were attacking a city by the name of Kaffa. They were not able to complete their attack because a plague had recently infected them. But in a last attempt to bring destruction to the city of Kaffa, they armed some catapults with some bodies of dead plague victims and threw them in the walls of the city. This actually worked, and Kappa was struck with the force of the plague. Anyways, with more of Europe becoming infected, the rate of disease being spread raised, mainly because of how Europe was connected through trade routes. Although the plague would kill its host pretty quickly, there were a lot of people going through trade routes, meaning the fleas that were on humans could go easily onto other humans and spread the plague quicker, faster, and easier. Another point is that the stops along these routes, also known as caravanserai, allow the traders to be in close contact with animals and other traders, which may have caused the disease to spread even quicker and easier. It is also thought that this plague killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population over the course of 3 to 4 years. These deaths obviously varied from place to place, with some areas having mortality rates with over 80%, and with some areas almost like it had never even been touched by the plague. How did the plague affect England, which is the outcome? The plague caused a lot of damage and killed off many people. But there were a few benefits that have arisen from this terrible pandemic. With so much of the population of Europe lowering by up to 60%, there were an insufficient amount of workers to do work. There wasn't enough people to work on farms and trades, so the laborers were able to demand better pay for the work. I mean, who else was going to do the work? And with that, the peasants and serfs were able to afford better living conditions and lifestyles, buying better clothes and such. But of course, rich people like to be very differentiated from the poor, or well, what used to be the poor, and they wanted to put the peasants back into their place. So what they did was buy more expensive and extravagant items like clothing and tried their best to put the peasants back into their horrible lifestyle. Obviously, no peasant would want to go back, so they rose up and revolted. This led to multiple riots and revolts, one of which is the famous Great Revolt in June 1381 Common Era. The peasants won, of course, and the feudal system was basically dismantled. Not only did the plague affect Europe through economy, but through medical practice as well. The doctors during these times were quite fond of using traditional methods of medicine, like the classic bloodletting, withdrawing blood to cure a disease. When they realized that these methods weren't working and that the patients that do survive probably because of luck, they became more open to newer ideas and they tried out newer things. And it wasn't just economic and medical practices, it was also art and architecture. Art had become more realistic and had focused more on death. After the plague, pretty much everyone had a weird obsession with death. They also realized that they were going to die soon, so they wanted to take every opportunity to be happy. You can see this in the elite of society. They decided to buy paintings that focus more on the religious and death side because they wanted to lock their place in heaven. But with good sides come bad sides. So, what what is this bad thing that happened? Well, when something bad happens, which is the plague, you would probably become frustrated if you didn't know the cause. You would probably want something or even someone to blame because no one likes blaming themselves. So, during the Black Plague, people wanted to blame someone for what was happening at the time. So, of course, they chose the long hated Jews. Christians already didn't like the Jews, and when they saw that their communities were being way more affected than the Jews' communities, they were mad. They thought that the Jews were causing this whole plague and that this was their fault, and to solve their problems or just get revenge, they decided to destroy whole communities of Jews. Communities of Jews were wiped out in Germany, Austria, and France, and one of the big or large contributors to this was the flagellant movement, which is basically a group of people who would whip themselves to solve this whole plague thing. The flagellant movement disrupted communities. They told everyone that Jews are bad and that they are the cause of the plague, even if the person who was running the whole thing had no religious training. But this also brings me to my next slide. What helped to stop this whole plague? Well, let's first talk about what didn't stop the plague, so we can learn from our mistakes. Going back to the other side, I was talking about flagellants, people who would whip themselves in order to solve the plague. This group of people started back in Austria, but it slowly gained more followers as it traveled to various towns. This group of people would whip themselves with leather whips with knots at the ends. Sometimes they may even have spikes or nails attached to them. Ouch. They did this to imitate what was happening to Jesus when he was being crucified, copying what the Roman guards were doing to him. Every time they went through towns and villages, they would gain more followings and their movement would become even stronger. As they whipped themselves in public, they left blood on roads or even people. Some people saw this as holy relics. Some of these flagellants even wore hoods and covered everything except for their backs to show that they were not holy figures and that they were doing this for God or their religion. This was only stopped in October 1349 when the actual Pope, Pope Clement VI, said that the flagellants were not following the right rules of the church and they should stop. Anyways, the next few cures are all about medical practices. The first cure we have on the list is crushing emeralds and ingesting them. Obviously, this cure was only for the rich, as only they could afford such a thing. This didn't work and probably only made them more unpleasant, as consuming crushed emeralds seems pretty hard and could put more stress on the body when inside the stomach. The second cure is a pretty common one throughout history, and that is bloodletting. Bloodletting is the practice of withdrawing blood from a human's body in order to balance, in quotations, out the blood to take out everything bad out of the human. They did this by cuts and even using leeches. This didn't work, as you need that blood to deliver oxygen, and if you lose blood, your body needs to produce that blood again, and it probably puts more stress on your immune system, which is actually fighting the plague. Now, the next two, or last two, are pretty disgusting and gross, but if you look throughout history, you'd probably expect this one, and it's bathing or covering yourself with urine or human feces. Yep. Urine could be seen with the Romans as mouthwash and a cleaning agent, so they probably thought it would be good for cleansing whatever was inside the body. And to apply this, they would have infected people bathe in tubs of clean, yeah, clean urine and feces. To apply the feces, they would wrap them or put them on the buboes and wrap the bandage on top to keep the feces in. This was just a recipe to have even more diseases come up and promote more bacteria. Anyways, those were all the fake cures that didn't work. Now for the actual cure. Well, there wasn't an actual cure, only theories for what could have happened. Many people believe that the way they applied quarantines worked, or maybe it was the cold weather. How about the improvement of hygiene, or maybe everything combined? We know that quarantines work, as we can see that in flattening of the curve and everything. One of the first implemented quarantine measures was from Venice, Italy. They did this by turning away ships and closing their docks, and requiring ships to wait before they can leave. This also included the people in towns. People were required to isolate for 30, then raised to 40 days, giving enough time to know if they're affected and if they will die or survive. Of course, this did not entirely wipe out the disease, as you can see it come back again and again, but it did give relief to communities and gave them time to build back. Smallpox. What is smallpox and what are the symptoms? Smallpox is a contagious, fatal disease caused by the variola virus. This virus attacks your skin, bone marrow, and spleen. When first infected, symptoms won't show for 10 to 14 days. During this time, the virus cannot be spread, so that's good. And there will be no signs that you have the virus, so that's bad. After this time, you can get symptoms such as fever, severe fatigue, severe back pain, discomfort, and headaches. A few days after you have been infected, rashes that consist of small red spots start to appear on your hands, forearms, face, and chest, and your back. In a day, these spots can turn into blisters that are filled with pus and later become scabs. The pus is also very infectious, so you probably don't want to touch that. These scabs leave behind deep scars. Smallpox has a mortality rate of 30%, and even if you did survive, you would still carry all the deep scars those spots left behind. What did smallpox do to indigenous people? Well, let's first talk about how they did this to indigenous people. So, smallpox had never existed in North America. The Native Americans had never been exposed to a related disease, or really any disease, as they lived in very different conditions than the rest of the world. You see, in North America, there weren't many animals that you could domesticate. There were only buffaloes and llamas. And just imagine trying to domesticate 440 to 990 kilograms of muscle that is faster, bigger, and way stronger to you. Not to mention they travel in massive herds, so you could only hunt them. So the only option these Native Americans had was to domesticate llamas. But llamas weren't that great to domesticate. They're not like a cow. They don't have much meat. They're hard to control, and etc. Now, let's compare that to Eurasia. They have a bunch of animals that are easier to domesticate. The only downside there is that they have diseases that come with these animals. For example, cowpox, the flu, tuberculosis, measles, mumps, all come from animals like cows, birds, pigs, you name it, there's a disease from it. For example, COVID-19, guess where that's from? Bats. Anyways, these diseases brought devastation to Europe, but there were always people that survived and gained immunity. Eventually, everyone in Europe had gained a good immunity to these diseases, only sometimes dying or catching the virus. The Native Americans weren't exposed to anything like this. They weren't exposed to animals like the Europeans were, meaning that they couldn't develop immunity and they couldn't produce as much food as Europeans, meaning less population, they had to spend more time to hunt, etc. Now, imagine what would happen if an entirely new disease was exposed to a whole continent that hasn't even come close to the disease like it. Well, I mean, look at this year, COVID-19, a new disease, shocked the entire world. Unknown, no history, no human has ever had it, highly contagious and deadly. Now, just imagine what might have happened to the Native Americans. Well, when they got exposed to smallpox and other European diseases, millions died. Tens of millions. A notable example of this is the fall of the Aztec Empire, when a man named Hernan Cortez arrived at the Aztec Empire. He realized that this place was valuable and needed to be his. Luckily for him, he was gifted with a translator that was armed with the knowledge of local languages. Her name was Malitzin. With her help, Hernan was able to gain allies, internal and external, of the Aztec Empire. You see, at the time, people inside of the Aztec Empire didn't really like their leader. And with the help of his allies from inside and outside of the Aztec Empire, he was able to take down Moctezuma II, the ruler of the Aztec Empire. But this wouldn't be possible without their superior weapons and, of course, the European diseases that Cortez brought along with his men. In November 1519, Common Era, Cortez took down Moctezuma II and had rule over the empire. But even when it was his, smallpox still had their reign, reducing the population by 40% in 1 year. Moctezuma's nephew, Kohatamuluk, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this. I searched up online, but there's no videos or guides to pronounce this. So, sorry. Cuauhtémoc or took over and was able to drive the Spanish out of the Aztec Empire. But his rule ended at the hands of Cortés on August 13, 1521 Common Era. Another example that you may be familiar with is the 1862 smallpox outbreak in British Columbia. And you may know that during this time was the Caribou Gold Rush. And on March 12, 1862, a boat full of miners from San Francisco arrived in Victoria for work. One of these miners brought something extra with them, which was smallpox. This miner had interacted with many, including indigenous people, before departing. This caused lots of indigenous people to be infected with smallpox. A month later, local First Nations were devastated and had a hard time dealing with the virus. Unfortunately, an idiot, also known as the Commissioner of Police, named Joseph Pemberton, ordered the First Nations in camps and infected First Nations to go back to their homeland, which is in the northern part of BC. This escalated even further when the police started to force them to go back by holding them at gunpoint, burning down camps, and even forcefully towing their canoes, which were full of First Nations. This only made the situation worse by putting all of the infected First Nations into one area and the smallpox spread even further. Eventually, smallpox was spread throughout the whole province through travel and trade. Over the next year, 30,000 First Nations died, and all of this could have been prevented by implementing a general quarantine, or even giving them the vaccine in the first place, which was available at the time. Just think about it. If you have an infected person in your community, would you send them back to where they came from and infect everyone there, or would you just implement simple quarantine rules for everyone so that everyone stays safe and the damage is minimized? How did smallpox affect indigenous peoples' populations, and how did it affect them afterwards? Smallpox took a huge role in the colonization of America. Smallpox devastated entire indigenous cultures and communities. It killed up to 90% of indigenous people and disrupted their culture. With smallpox, the colonizers were able to easily take control and steal land from the First Nations because of this huge decrease in the population. And of all the suffering indigenous people had to go through. Sometimes they even just gave up because was there any point in fighting? Many were devastated. Lots of culture and people were lost because of this horrible disease. If smallpox was never a factor in the colonization of America, the outcome could have been very different. First of all, it would have been harder for colonizers to conquer America, as they might have not even been able to do it. There would have been more native people, meaning there would have been more information, more army, more power. Disease was a huge factor, and oh, disease was a huge factor, and the outcome could have been very different. Oh my gosh. Uh, cut it, James. There would have been more native people, meaning there would have been more information, more army, more power. Disease was a huge factor, and the outcome could have been very different than what we are seeing today. America was depopulated of its indigenous people, which has scarred many, and I mean many indigenous people. The pain that indigenous people carried transferred on generations, which is why we see so many people suffer today. An estimate of 56 million people out of 60 million people, indigenous people, died from the start of the 1600s. That is 93% of the population of indigenous people in North America. How was the smallpox disease able to spread so quickly? Smallpox is an already very contagious virus. It can be contracted through the air, and even just touching the pus that comes out of the red spots can get you the virus. Infection is at its strongest during the first weeks of symptoms showing. Now, what helped the virus to be spread even further? Well, let's talk about the first reason: trade and travel. It takes 10 to 14 days for you to be able to transmit the disease. So during this time period, people probably went over to other tribes to trade or just went to travel with other communities. Little did they know that they could be transmitting the virus after 10 days. This cycle repeats itself, with more unsuspecting people not knowing that they are infected and transferring the disease onto more unsuspecting people. A second reason is isolating whole indigenous communities from with infected people, causing the whole community to become infected. This is exactly what happened with the smallpox outbreak in 1862. The colonizers pushed all of the indigenous people into one area, the northern part of BC, and they got infected. And the third reason smallpox could have spread so quickly was because it was intentional. See, the Europeans probably wanted the indigenous people to die so that they could take their land and resources. So, of course, they would want to spread a deadly virus that they are immune to, but not to them. This can be seen with Henry Boquet, who purposely tried to transmit the virus to indigenous people. He said, quote, "We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them," end quote. And them are the indigenous people. On July 13, 1763, Henry promised to spread smallpox through contaminated blankets. Little did he know, someone was already trying that. His name was William Trent. William had a journal, and in that he wrote about how he gave contaminated blankets and handkerchiefs to two Native American diplomats as gifts in a journal. And he even wrote, "I hope it will have the desired effect." Now, these two incidents were the only documented attempt to transmit the virus to indigenous people. But this could have been repeated by other colonizers as well. I mean, these two people, William and Henry, they didn't even know each other. So many other colonizers could have done the exact same. What helped to stop this pandemic? How were they able to stop the smallpox virus? When indigenous people got the virus, they treated it with traditional medicine like dancing, praying, and drum and rattle spells. The most common medical treatment, though, was sweat lodges. Sweat lodges are usually dome-shaped huts that are meant for steam baths. The way indigenous people would accomplish this was by having a fire in the little hut thing and heating up stones. Stuff like cedar, grass, and herbs would be placed on these stones. You can see how small these sweat lodges can be and how much heat can be trapped inside. Anyways, water would then be poured onto the heated stones, and that would create a ton of steam, causing everyone inside the little hut to sweat. This ritual was meant to purify and heal your body and soul. These methods didn't actually prove to cure the entire smallpox virus, but there is one method that is 100% proved to give you immunity to these diseases, and that is a vaccine. In fact, smallpox helped modern medicine to come up with these vaccines, and the first cure actually appeared in 1022, Sichuan, China. A Buddhist nun in China would take scabs of the victims of smallpox and grind up the scabs. That would make it into a powder, and she would blow the powder into the nostrils of healthy people. The reason she did this was because she observed that people who had suffered from smallpox survived and never contracted the virus ever again. This method worked, but it wasn't exactly a vaccine. Fast forward 700 years later, 1700 Common Era. Doctors would do the same methods as the Buddhists, but instead of blowing it into their nostrils, they would make cuts for the virus to get in. This worked, but again, it wasn't a vaccine. It's known as variolation, also known as inoculation. This took the actual virus and put it into healthy humans. Now, this was a way of gaining immunity, but it had a mortality rate of 3%, and that isn't good enough. If you didn't have any immunity like the indigenous people, though, it was still worth taking the risk, as there's a very high chance of getting smallpox. But the only actual safe way of building the right immunity was through vaccines, which in reality a dairymaid came up with. That is a misconception. People actually think only Edward Jenner came up with it, but a dairymaid came up with it. Edward Jenner was the only man who actually tested it. When Edward Jenner was 13, he overheard a dairymaid saying she would never get smallpox since she already had a cowpox. Later on in his life, when he became a doctor, he thought about it and realized she may have been onto something. Smallpox and cowpox are from the same family, so if you get cowpox and survive that, then you might have the same antibodies to fight against smallpox. So, in 1796, he took the pus from a cowpox blister and inserted it into an incision on a boy called James Phipps. The boy was 8 at the time and was sick for 2 days, but he was able to fully recover. When he was exposed to smallpox through an incision, he never showed any symptoms of smallpox. This meant that the first vaccination was formed, and this revolutionized modern medicine and helped to immunize many people. Vaccines. What are vaccines and how do they work? Your body has a great and complex immune system. If an antigen gets through the skin and linings of the inner organs, your body will recognize it as foreign and, if needed, will make specialized cells to kill the antigen. However, this process can take a few days, which may be too long to defend against diseases like measles, which could lead to your death. That is where vaccines come in. Vaccines are products that give immunity to diseases and viruses. They come in forms like nasal sprays and needle shots. Basically, they train your body to make the right antibodies to destroy a disease. Weakened or killed versions of diseases, enter your body through injection or nasal spray. Your body will then identify the vaccine as an antigen and will attempt to destroy it. This will be very easy for your body because the vaccine is killed or very weakened. Once your body has destroyed the vaccine, some of the T cells and B cells that fought the antigen will become memory cells. And as their name suggests, these cells remember what the antigen was like and how to defeat the antigen. They stay in your body for a long time, but they don't survive forever. That's why people need to get booster shots. And you can see on the picture on the right, you can see some T cells attacking a virus. So that's pretty cool. Comparison to us and COVID-19. How many people would have been infected in the greater Vancouver area if we were exposed to these diseases without vaccines? How about the whole population of Canada? So, the bubonic plague had an estimate of 1/3 to a whole half of Europe's population. That's the mortality rate. I did both, and for 1/3, 833,333 people would have died. If it goes all the way up to a whole half, that would have been 1,250,000. Smallpox killed 90% of Native Americans. That means 2,250,000 people would have died. Only 25,000 people would have been left. Only 10%. For Canada's whole population, it would have been 12,500,000 deaths if it was 1/3. For a whole half, that would have been 18,750,000 deaths from the bubonic plague. But the smallpox were to come with a 90% mortality rate, that would have killed 33,750,000 people. What did we learn, and what are we doing similarly or differently? For starters, let's talk about what we learned from both of these diseases. Let's start off with the bubonic plague. It was a very hard time of struggle, but from it we learned a lot of things, or quite a few things. We learned how to isolate and quarantine ourselves. We can see this work today. We also learned a lot just from how it spread. Almost all of Europe got the virus, and that would have been impossible unless for that would have been impossible unless they had trade routes like the ones that they do have in Europe, like the Silk Road. We can learn that if people have sickness in one area, we should probably stop any routes or roads unless they are really needed. We can see this today as we stop travel from country to country unless it's really needed. And if someone does come from an infected place, they would be put into quarantine, and it works. We can see that in BC. From the aftermath of this bubonic plague, medical doctors also learned that some of their methods may just be bogus and not work entirely. After the whole bubonic plague, doctors became more specialized in surgery and became more open to new medical ideas. If this had not happened, we could still be covering ourselves and ingesting feces and urine today. Gross. Now, what did we learn from smallpox, and are we implementing what we learned today? Well, one of the first things we learned is how strong biological warfare can actually be, and how dangerous a disease can easily wipe out entire cultures. When smallpox was first brought to America, the Native Americans had no immunity to these diseases. This led to their populations being decreased by a whole 90%. We can learn through these experiences uh, to not bring any flu or sickness anywhere. For example, don't bring a new flu disease to a whole country. That's probably going to wipe them out if they don't have a vaccine. Or if you're sick, have the flu, just don't go to work or don't go to school. That's pretty simple. You're going to spread that flu to your coworkers or your classmates. But the biggest thing we've learned is vaccinations. From the smallpox disease, Edward Jenner was able to start making vaccines, which would shape modern medicine and pretty much save the entire world from diseases. We can see this being used today as vaccinations, and they're proven to completely eradicate diseases and give you really good immunity. You see that in measles, mumps, and smallpox. The way you that way you can go out feeling safe that you are not getting the influenza virus or measles, really anything. We also see this with COVID-19. Scientists and doctors are all trying to develop a good vaccine for COVID-19. And that was my entire presentation. I'm sorry if it was a bit long. I wanted to try and do a video like what Miss Johnson did. And yeah, this is my bibliography. And thank you for watching my presentation.